Welcome back to Lim's Cryptoverse. Everyone's confused, including myself, about all these technical terms on blockchain and cryptocurrency. But one we really need to understand is the consensus mechanisms. That's the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. So today I'm going to talk to you a little about them and try to explain two or three differences between proof of work and proof of stake, and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of them. So let's get started. As I mentioned, there's two types of critical components to a blockchain's consensus. And these components allow for Sybil, here's another $15 word, Sybil Resistance. That's basically protecting the blockchain from what's called a Sybil attack, like spam, for example, and 51% attacks. So let's talk about Sybil resistance. That's a mechanism that establishes a cost that disincentivizes a bad actor from maliciously taking over as sole arbiter of consensus. That's basically, in layman's terms, Sybil resistance basically keeps a dictator from controlling the network. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Sybil attack is an exploit against an online network where a small number of entities, a dictator, or just a few, take control of the whole network. And in social networks, they can generate multiple accounts and create spam. They could run nodes that influence the network. The word Sybil actually comes from a case study of a woman named Shirley Adele Mason who received treatment for a dissociative identity disorder, some type of multiple personality disorder. And the most commonly known Sybil attack is, of course, the 51% attack, which I mentioned earlier. And proof of work and proof of stake are economic deterrents that stop people or try to stop users from taking over the network. And basically, you want to show that you have some skin in the game. And there's two types of skin in the game. There's the proof of work, right, where we have computational power. And in order to have computational power, you need to own all this expensive computational equipment, right, for the hash rate to solve these puzzles. And it's very expensive, not just because you have to buy the computers, but you have to spend enormous amounts of electricity. I mean, huge amounts of electricity. There's so much electricity needed for proof of work that in total, it's as much as a country. So that's pretty damn big. And I also want to talk to you about something called Byzantine fault tolerance. I'm sorry, before we go to that, I failed to mention proof of stake. Proof of stake also has requirements, but not electricity requirements. Well, it has that too, but the biggest requirement is that you have to almost like put money, crypto, into custody, into a safe, and that's called staking. And so either one of them, proof of work or proof of stake, require huge amounts of computer hardware or cryptocurrencies in terms of proof of stake. Now I want to talk to you about BFT, which is Byzantine fault tolerance. And this alludes to what's called the Byzantine generals problem. And that's basically how do you run an army if you can't hear the orders from the general, right? It's almost impossible, right? So basically, the Byzantine generals problem highlights the problem with distributed networks where independent participants need to form an agreement, or they need to figure out how to make a solution when they don't have someone on top, a general, telling them what to do. There's a lot. There's a lot to think about. Now, in terms of, I didn't talk to you about different types of proof of work and proof of stake. There's really one type of proof of work, and that's the one used by Bitcoin. There's other types, but really most of the proof of work, as you know, is in Bitcoin. Of course, there's Dogecoin and everything, but most of the money and computational power has to do and is tied up with Bitcoin. But when it comes to proof of stake, there's many types of proof of stake. You get the one that is implemented by Cardano, and I can't remember that name. It's a Nakamoto style consensus. It's called Ouroboros, I think. And then you have the one that's used by Ethereum too. And then you have, and that's on the Beacon chain, also called, the method's called Casper. And then you have the one that's very common. This is probably the most common or the most well-known proof of stake. And that's the one on Solana, which is called PoS, which is proof of history. But there are many, many others. So I wanted to talk to you about the pros and cons of proof of work versus proof of stake. Proof of work is battle tested, right? Because if you look at Bitcoin, it's been around since the financial crisis back in 2008, I believe. And it's very expensive. You need 51% of the blockchain network to have an attack, and that's a huge amount of money. So that's a benefit. But on a negative side of that, outside of Bitcoin, it's not that expensive because then you'd be looking at smaller networks. And I'm not talking about Ethereum. We're going to Ethereum 2.0, which is moving towards proof of stake. So I'm going to leave out Ethereum. But I'm talking about Litecoin and Dogecoin. Those are smaller networks that require much less money to take over. So that's a negative in the proof of works. And let me think of some other ones. Yeah, large intermediaries have less influence on the governance of proof of work, but they may not in a proof of stake, because when you have proof of stake, you're doing a lot of pooling, right? Whether it's centralized exchanges or just operators that do pooling. So you have to be careful with collusion of those operators. And one positive of proof of work is that it incentivizes minor operators to distribute geographically and via organizations. And this stems from the fact that electricity costs vary geographically, and even within geographies, those electricity costs vary by location and by time. So again, proof of work seems to have a better fault tolerance than proof of stake, at least for Bitcoin. So proof of work considerations. I think I mentioned this to you already. Proof of work has huge energy consumption and thus a high energy, carbon footprint. Now I want to talk to you about a narrative that's going around that is simply wrong. Is that we don't need to worry about Bitcoin's carbon footprint if Bitcoin uses renewable energy, and especially if the renewable energy is a remote location. I completely disagree with that. If Bitcoin is using a lot of energy, which it is, then to me, that's it. It's over. That argument is over. It's using energy. Don't make up stories that it's using energy in a remote location, it's using hydro energy, so it doesn't matter. It does matter because that energy in your remote location could be used for something else rather than Bitcoin. So I disagree with this narrative that Bitcoin can move to become renewable. That's not going to solve the energy problem. The only way to solve the energy problem for Bitcoin's proof of work is for it to move to proof of stake. Sorry, guys. What else? I think I mentioned this also too. Smaller proof of work blockchains such as Dogecoin and Verge and Bitcoin Gold, I suppose. They may have security issues, but of course, Bitcoin is not going to have that issue. And one other consideration is that it's hard for individual miners, like people like you and me, to continuously upgrade to the next version of Antminer. You know, those ASIC-based mining rigs. It's getting more and more expensive as the hash rate goes up. This is true and not true. I mean, you see the same issue with proof of stake. We could talk about that later. And this is here's another critical part of proof of work. Some people say that this trial and error architecture of solving the puzzle in mining entails a delay in block production, and that's true. It's Bitcoin is simply slower than the Bitcoin blockchain is simply slower than others, than the blockchains using proof of stake. That's true. That's a fact. Yes, there's a Lightning network, but other chains have their own versions of the Lightning network. They have their own layer twos. So I think this is a good criticism that Bitcoin is slower. So let's talk about proof of staking. I think I mentioned some of this. Number one, achieving Sybil Resistance using proof of stake uses like 99% less energy consumption than proof of work. So that's a very, very big advantage for proof of stake. Proof of stake also eliminates the need for validators to constantly purchase and upgrade the hardware. So that's also very good. And thirdly, honest validators could decide to remove attackers from the network. So there's a different mechanism on proof of staking than proof of work that allows this to happen. And another positive is that proof of stake blockchains, as I mentioned earlier, is just simply faster. And there's also lower barriers to entry to become a validator in a PoS system. Some considerations, some negatives of proof of staking. Obviously, because it's newer, it hasn't been battle tested like Bitcoin. Also, and I mentioned to this earlier too, the supply distribution of proof of stake in systems may introduce voter concentration. And it depends how, what systems they're using. Are the staking pools, are those pools centralized? Or is Coinbase going to become more and more involved with staking? Also, one thing that worries me is we talk about this 51% attack that you hear about in Bitcoin, right? In Bitcoin, you need to have 51% of the computational power to take over the network. But BFT-style consensus on proof-of-stake blockchains only require 33% consensus. And that's the problem. I think there's a lower fault tolerance. You can I think you can take over the network more easily with validators on a proof of stake system rather than Bitcoin's proof of work. So that's clear negative. And in certain cases, proof of stake is potentially vulnerable to centralization. And I mentioned this earlier with the staking pools. So what's important is to look at not just staking pools, but the Nakamoto coefficient. You want a high Nakamoto coefficient on a proof of stake network. So So what's the end? What do we think? What do I think in terms of the blockchain trilemma? Which network is more secure, proof of work or proof of stake? At this time, I think proof of work is more secure, but it's slower.